Hello, welcome again after the break. My name is Michalina Sablik, and I'm very excited to present to you our keynote speaker, Jack Halberstam, who is a David Finlayson professor at Columbia University. He's an author of several influential books on queer, gender and transgender theory, including in Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Trans, a Quick and Quirky Account for Gender Variance. And recently he was a subject of the movie entitled So We Moved by Adam Pendleton. And in 2024, he was named a Guggenheim Fellow. Now he's working on his newest book that is entitled Architecture After Everything. But for our presentation, for our conference, he decided to change the topic of the presentation, so it won't be the topic that you see on the screen, but it will be Transpolitics After the End of the World. Jack, I'm very happy that you're here. We are honored. I think that most of the audience know your intellectual work for over a decade. We are very honored and grateful that you are here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michalina. Thank you to the whole identity crisis team. I think we're all having identity crises by now. It's been a very successful day. And, you know, it's also it's a very timely topic, identity crisis. And I have heard several people speak today eloquently about the limits that we have linguistically and semantically in terms of even trying to explain to each other the circumstances that we're in right now, the crisis that we face, a crisis in which we are unable to talk about ongoing genocide in Gaza without attracting certain kinds of accusations. We're in a moment where there are open attacks on trans people, some of which have been launched by feminists, making this particular conjuncture highly confusing. So what I'm going to speak about today, and this is actually drawn from the book that my original title came from, the book that I've been working on for 10 years is called Anarchitecture After Everything. And it is an attempt to craft a different language for this particular historical moment in order to be able to talk about the need to dismantle the condition that we call world that has created this particular configuration of crises. So there are a number of different ways that I address the crises that we inhabit. And anarchitecture is the language that I'm going to be using. Let me explain what anarchitecture is for people who may or may not be familiar with that term. And I draw this term from an art movement in the 1970s. And so this is my first sort of recommendation to us, is that in trying to figure out what to do in this particular moment, maybe we should look back rather than forwards. Maybe we should be looking back rather than forwards. Maybe in the past and in earlier moments of aesthetic disruption and political radicalism, maybe there were lessons to be learned that we have not picked up on, that could tell us something specific about the moment that we're in. That, at least, is the opportunity that I saw when I was introduced to the work of a collective from the 1970s who called themselves the Anarchitecture Group. So from the Anarchitecture Group, and I will explain that term in a moment, the first terminology that I want to propose to you today is this language of destitution. I'm not, like Simon in many ways, I'm not going to argue for things. In a way, I'm going to argue that the only way to address the crisis or the multiple crises that we currently face, is to destitute the configuration that we call world. And by the end of the talk, we'll actually arrive in a place where I discuss something called unworlding, which doesn't necessarily tell us how we do this, but it at least aesthetically conjures an opposition to this totality of world. So let's begin by using the language of destitution, and I want to explain to you how this comes out of anarchitecture. Destitution is a terminology or a way of thinking that emerged in Europe, partly from this anonymous collective called the Invisible Committee, that sort of had something to do with Agamben, but they kind of have their own thing going. And about 7 years ago, they produced a little manifesto called Now. And the fourth chapter of that manifesto was titled Destitute the World, Destitute the World. And in a recent issue dedicated to thinking with the theoretical paradigm of destitution, Kieran Ahrens and Idris Robinson describe destitution this way. Destitution means to tear down, dismantle, and cancel prevailing political representations and institutions without proposing others to replace them. And I know that this sounds counterintuitive and wrong, and inevitably somebody will say to me at the end, well, okay, if we go with you on this mission to tear everything down, what do we want to build in its place? But that's the problem. That's the problem, is that we are too quick to leap towards utopia and start imagining what comes next. And when you do that, you trail all of the current ideological commitments with you into the next paradigm. So destitution, in many ways, is asking for a kind of discipline where we think together about how to take apart the epistemological frames, the philosophies, the political theories that we have available to us, that we use them to take apart the ideologies that we inhabit. But we do so without already knowing where we're going. And that, it really takes, a certain kind of forbearance to hold back from the rebuilding. And I think the rebuilding and the healing and the repairing is part of the problem. And so we're going to look instead at what happens when we stay with breaking and dismantling and destituting. So this is an example of the artwork that I'm talking about under the heading of Anarchitecture. Anarchitecture was very much the brainchild of one particular artist, Gordon Matta-Clark, who was a Chilean-American artist who grew up in New York City in the 50s and 60s, went off to Cornell to study architecture and art with all kinds of amazing people, Robert Smithson and others up at Cornell, then came back to New York City with his graduate training in hand and used that graduate training to start unbuilding things. So for me, that already actually tells us something about destitution. What if we use the training that we were given to take apart the institution that gave us that training? That's destitution. You see what I mean? He went off to school, he studied architecture, he came back to New York City, and he could see the architecture was in collaboration with new forms of real estate capital. And so Matta-Clark decided that the order of the day was to unbuild things. So he went around the city and he found abandoned buildings, of which there were many in the 1970s. And into those buildings, he introduced holes, voids, vacancies, spaces. I really like this particular image because it gives you a sense also of the disorientation of an anarchitectural cut. This is called Bronx floors. There were many, many buildings in New York City in the 1970s that had been abandoned by landlords, many of whom burned down their buildings in order to collect insurance and move their tenants out. And then the burned buildings simply stood rotting in the Bronx, and no money from the city was going towards those buildings. So Matta-Clark would go into those buildings and create these cuts. This is a cut in the floor of the building, and he was very fond of cutting into floors rather than walls where we usually put windows, or roofs where we put skylights. He literally cut into the foundation of the building, and in doing so, he asks a question which is about architecture itself. What is it for? What is a house? How does a house work? Who does a house house, right? Why do we only think about houses as these uniform boxes with a primary bedroom, 2 little bedrooms, a dining room, a living room, and a kitchen? Why do we not build spaces for people to live in who are not related to each other, for people who are new arrivals to a city, for people who work multiple jobs across many, many hours? What does that architecture look like? We don't know, because cities don't build those kinds of buildings. So when Matta-Clark makes these cuts, he is literally offering, in the form of an aesthetic gesture, a critique of the entire system within which architecture is nested. And that's a little bit what I mean by unworlding, unbuilding, and destitution, is that it's not enough to simply have a critique. We have to take apart the whole structure within which that critique makes sense. So Matta-Clark went around the city, he made these cuts, and every single building that he cut into was demolished, okay? Often within hours, usually within weeks, certainly within months. Not a single piece of his archive remains. And that's the legacy. The legacy is nothing. The legacy is the void. The legacy is the vacancy. But more than that, the legacy is the language. And it's that language that I'm using now to try to think with alternative framings of trans bodies, and then of a politics of the city. And we'll see how this plays out. So this is Matta-Clark. He wrote on note cards. Remember the 1970s, there's no computers, there are no cell phones. Most cities, certainly cities in Europe, were falling down, were still full of rubble from World War II. Many cities, many countries had not rebuilt the cities that had been bombed. And into that sort of destitution comes all of this motivation for aesthetic work and change. So what did Matta-Clark think he was doing? He said, what I do to the building is what some do with language and others with groups of people, i.e., I organize them in order to explain and defend the need for change. Explain and defend the need for change. Now, at least one other critic other than me has proposed that when he made these cuts into a building, it was like surgery. And there's already a kind of conception within which we think of the architect as a masculine figure, and we think of the house as a kind of feminine subject, right? And houses are often compared to the female body. We've just heard all of these presentations about pregnancy, because the house houses bodies, people live in them. So you can see that making surgical cuts into a body has symbolic implications for gendering. What if we thought about these cuts in some way as gender reassignment cuts? What if we thought about the house under the condition of anarchitecture as a completely rearranged logic of embodiment? And that's at least the proposal that I'm going to make. People did understand those cuts in those terms in Matta-Clark's time, and at least one feminist critic accused Matta-Clark of raping the house when he made the cut into it. And he was a super cool dude, by the way, a straight guy, not trans, not queer in any way, shape, or form, but a very cool guy. He heard that critique, and instead of being defensive about it, he listened to it, and he never made another cut into a domestic building. After that, all of his cuts were into industrial buildings, like the piers on the west side of Manhattan, or into office space, or into museums. And because he could see what the logic was of saying, if you take a chainsaw to a house, and we already have this symbolic system where we understand the house as being like a female body, wouldn't that symbolically register as a rape? He's like, no, that's not how I intend it, but I hear you, okay? For me, all that means is that there is a precedent for thinking in these terms about the relationship between the anarchitect and the house. The other thing, this term, anarchitect, immediately sort of tells you about the gesture, because the architect, of course, is the master builder and is a central player in what was then called in the 1970s urban renewal, or what we now term gentrification. And by the way, we are at the other end of the paradigm that began in the 1970s, when cities began to be rebuilt in the 1970s. That's really when the house became part of speculative capital, as opposed to being a unit of possession simply. It became a unit of speculative capital. We're at the other end of that now. So in the 1970s, these cuts were attempting to forestall what people saw coming in the form of real estate domination. Now, think about it. In the US, we have a fascist real estate president, right? And it isn't an accident that he made his money in real estate. Donald Trump made his money in the 1970s in New York City, which was being rebuilt and turned into speculative capital through selling buildings to people for the purpose of having them hide their money in these buildings. And the housing crisis that we currently face also began in that period. So I see anarchitecture then, if we take that as an understanding of architecture, real estate, and capital, the whole process of anarchitecture is to really introduce a paradigm of anarchy into our thinking about the city. And I mean anarchy in the sense that anarchism is a critique of the property regime, right? Property is theft, said Proudhon. On top of that, we tend to think about the subject, the individual, in terms of possession, in terms of a kind of possessive investment in the body and in the self. So if we were to take these things apart, if we were to think with anarchitecture, we would end up with different values for something and nothing. Remember, the cut is a nothing. We would end up with a new model of the subject, and hopefully we would strike up a new relationship to dwellings and housing that did not run through property. And that, in many ways, if there was a goal to anarchitecture, that was it. This is another one of these aphoristic statements that Matta-Clark wrote down on a note card, and all of these note cards have been collected. That is what the archive consists of at this point. Photographs, films, and all of these note cards that he meticulously wrote on and then were collected by his widow. Anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem. This is a really helpful, this is in a way the definition of anarchitecture. It is the withholding of the problem-solving modality that is embedded in government today. The reason anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem is because throughout the 20th century, up until about the 1970s, for architecture was seen as a way to solve social problems. So Le Corbusier, just as an example, said, well, the answer to social problems is either architecture or revolution. Le Corbusier, the fascist, chose architecture, okay? Matta-Clark chose revolution. And revolution comes in the form of making war on property, cutting into abandoned property, taking aim at the concept of property upon which worlds depend, taking apart world and delivering new understandings of body, space, city, buildings, emptiness, vacancy, and so on. All right, here's one final slide, just so you can have a look at what a Matta-Clark cut looks like. This is conical intersect. It was a cut that was made for the Paris Biennale in 1975. And this was at the moment that the Centre Pompidou was being built in Paris, and 2 17th century townhouses were being demolished to make way for this big new building, which of course now we all love and we think is so amazing. But at the time, it meant the destruction of an entire neighborhood, destruction in the form of commercialization of a residential district. So what did Matta-Clark do? He took the townhouses and he built this spiral shape into the emptiness of the townhouse. And from almost every part of the collapsing structure, you could see the construction in the distance of the Centre Pompidou. And that's what anarchitecture does. It offers a different framing of gentrification, a framing that looks at the something to come and frames it through a nothing, a spiral shape that empties out the interior of the townhouse. That townhouse was demolished 2 weeks after his making the cut. So, and also think about what it means to make artwork that can never be delivered to an art market. There's also a critique of the art market, which was taking off at exactly this moment, again, as a place for wealthy people to put their money. Wealthy people could put their money in the house or into art. And Matta-Clark is taking aim at both. And that's what I mean about looking back rather than forward, because people at the other end of the paradigm that we're living in saw this coming and had comments, had notes for us, in a way, notes for future readers of the urban landscape. And what they were saying to us was, you know, think of nothing, invest in nothing, work with the void, look into the vacancy, distrust ownership, beware property. So one of the things that I do in this book is I give a very thorough account of this art movement. I pull from that art movement a language of the void, the vacant, the empty, of dismantling, unmaking, undoing, and all of those words are then used to try to explain a new wave of artwork coming from artists interested in the trans body. And I'm not going to say trans artists, because many of those artists are resisting simply being captured by that term, but at least artists who are interested in the trans body are, whether they are deliberately doing so or not doesn't matter to me, but they tend to use an anarchitectural vocabulary. So I'm going to tell you about one such artist. This is the aftermath of a fire at the Jacob's Pillow Dance Center in Massachusetts. Very famous, very beautiful dance center that has roots going back to the early 20th century. And one of its buildings burnt down 2020, right before COVID. There was an artist, a trans artist, who was in residence at Jacob's Pillow at that time, Eve Laris Cohen. And while everyone was wringing their hands and saying, oh my God, this is terrible, look what's happened to the theater, Laris Cohen rushed to the scene of the fire and began to pull all of this material out of the wreckage. He then transported that material to MoMA, where he created a new installation out of it. And I want to explain this new installation. But to do so, let me give you another quote from Matta-Clark that will resonate with this work. Matta-Clark suggested that anarchitecture emphasized internal structures through extraction. Emphasized internal structures through extraction. This is exactly the method of Eve Laris-Cohen. And Laris-Cohen was, when he was growing up as a young girl, he was trained as a ballet dancer. And one of his clues about his own gender dissatisfaction was that he hated being forced to dance the girl part in the ballet. And much of his work involves not reproducing ballet per se, but unbuilding the actual theaters within which ballet takes place. So he literally unmade a sprung floor at one point that had been part of a Martha Graham theater. Anyway, here he pulled all of the innards of the theater out and transplanted them into MoMA, and this is what it looks like. So this became then the scene of a series of performances that Laris-Cohen enacted at MoMA. And I just want to think with you a little bit about what's happening here, okay? So you've pulled all of the innards out of a theater, all the piping, as it turns out, all the girders, the pipes, the internal organs of the theater have now been transplanted into a studio that is completely vacant and empty. So I would call this something like moving the wreckage from one scene of destruction and placing it into a site of emptiness and vacancy. And I would say that that would be a better way of talking about the trans body. Now, in this particular performance, Laris-Cohen was struggling with an undiagnosed gastric disorder that ended up being Crohn's disease, but at that point, no one knew what was wrong with him. So it's very significant that he pulled the bowels, if you like, out of the theater. One of the things that we do when we talk about trans bodies is we reduce them to their genitalia or their hormone delivery systems. But Laris-Cohen was thinking in terms of the body in a different way. For him, his drama in his body was in its internal dynamics, and he pulled the bowels out of the theater and placed them into this empty space. Then he took a winch and he would raise and lower the grid that he made from what was left of the theater, raised it and lowered it until his own body was exhausted. So I think you can see there's a kind of entropic motion to anarchitecture. There's an unbuilding and a destruction that does not ask for repair. And there's an investigation into the inner logics of the body that is not simply satisfied with the external morphology. People kept asking Laris-Cohen, why did that theater burn down? And he had this to say. He said, I'm not going to investigate why the theater burned down, and I'm not interested in why it burned down. My disinterest comes from both a trans and crip sensibility, from my desire to resist or refuse others' desires to know, whether it be gendered anatomical details about my body, or the cause of my chronic illness, which incidentally could also be classified as undetermined. So this is the epistemology that we've entered, one in which causes and effects are not connected, okay? The cause of a fire is irrelevant. What's relevant is the destruction that remains. There's no attempt here to rebuild the theater. There is instead a kind of communion with the wreckage. And that living with the wreckage and in the wreckage is what I mean by trans after the end of the world, right? Not trying to rebuild, right? Not knowing what comes next, not trying to solve, not quickly moving to repair. The reparative is already part of the logic of the present. And the reparative, if you think about it, can only ever return us to the status quo. So for me, this is an extremely compelling work that situates the trans body in relationship to destruction, in relationship to dismantling, in relationship to the architecture of the theater, and to performance, not simply as a body moving around in space, but an interaction between the body and the unbuilt environment. I think also that this grid is super interesting in the context of the art museum. We often talk about the grid aesthetically in terms of legibility, the way in which bodies can be seen and become recognized. In this case, the grid was committed 100% to a kind of illegibility and abstraction of the body. An abstraction, and I've argued this going all the way back to In a Queer Time and Place, abstraction is a way better strategy for the representation of the trans body, precisely because trans bodies seek not to be captured and classified by the system that has deemed them to be the problem. Remember, anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem. Similarly, the trans body seeks not to be legible in the system that has said, if you're not male and you're not female, then you must be this other horrible thing. Why would you want to become legible in that system? This grid is a refusal of that mode of legibility. Okay, I'm going to kind of leap out of this. So we've determined and established what anarchitecture is. I'm proposing to you that lots of artists who travel within or adjacent to the category of trans are using this particular language to articulate transness now. And I want to propose now, before moving on to destituting feminism, we'll get to that in a moment, I want to propose why this is better than the strategies that we have at the moment for articulating trans politics. So, and I am in no way blaming trans politics for the current predicament that we're in which trans people have become the targets of a global anti-gender movement that joins the Christian right to authoritarian politicians and to TERF feminists around the world, from Brazil to Hungary to the UK, all right? This horrible configuration of right-wing movements have decided that their main targets are immigrants and trans people, everything that is outside to their inside, right? But that cannot be countered by this. We can't counter the logic of the anti-gender movement with a call for rights and recognition. Why not? Because all it takes is for a new government to come in who says, well, maybe the government before us recognized you, but we don't, which is exactly, by the way, what has happened in the US and the UK. Acts have been overturned. I was just contacted last night to ask if I would serve in a legal case in Texas where a student group is trying to put on a drag show. And this is now against the law in Texas to put on a drag show. This is considered, why is it against the law? It's considered to violate the civil rights of women to have a performer stage a drag performance of femininity, right? So using this ammunition that feminism has served up to authoritarians, now it has become illegal to perform drag. This was a bad strategy all along. It was a strategy that was already part of a neoliberal ethos in which you are already, by neoliberalism, being included in governance strategies. And within that, you have trans groups saying, I want to be seen, I want to see versions of me on television, I want to be recognized, please get my gender pronoun right, and so on. Okay, so we're not going to persist, I would say, with this strategy. We would have to, in fact, insist that the entire gender system come apart in order to really ensure that we not keep switching back and forth between recognizing and not recognizing trans people. The real animus behind the attack on trans people, let's be clear, is that a massive percentage of young people identify as either gay, lesbian, trans, or non-binary. A massive percentage. And that's in Christian homes, right-wing homes, authoritarian households. Kids identify in one of those groups to the tune of about 50%, right? We very conservatively estimated gays and lesbians as like 15% of the population. We very conservatively estimated trans people around 5% of the population. And there are new statistics saying that some 20% of young people in the US identify as non-binary. That pushes you almost, not into the majority exactly, but this is what's fueling not just the attack on trans people, but the attack on education that we've seen in Europe, in Hungary, and that is becoming a big part of the attack on gender studies programs. So let's think then about this category of non-binary, and Simon began some of this work already this afternoon. But I'm very interested in the category of non-binary because rather than being a kind of adjacent parasitic category to gay, lesbian, and trans, it's the huge number of young kids who identify as non-binary that have in many ways induced this panic from the right, because you don't actually have to say something specific about your sexuality or your gender to say you're non-binary. And for many young people, that's extremely appealing. However, non-binary is being questioned, challenged, and seen as a conservative move, not by people on the right, but by trans people, trans theorists themselves. And I want to just explain how this works. So the person who's really responsible for this critique of non-binary is a trans theorist who I would call a kind of neocon trans theorist, Kaji Amin, who in a very smart essay began a massive takedown of the category of non-binary. And I want to explain what the takedown is and then offer a different reading of non-binary within which non-binary is part of the destituting logic that I'm after. So I know it's a long quote and I'll just sort of summarize what it means, but basically he's saying non-binary identity is not, as some non-binary people would have it, a radical refusal of the colonial gender binary. For binary Western thinking has governed every step in the history of Western gender sexual categories, generating an idealized opposite for each new category coined. Okay. The core binary that governs non-binary thought, however, is less that between binary and non-binary than that foundational to Western thought between the ontological sovereign individual and the unchosen genealogical bonds of the social. That's the real critique, I'll explain. It is therefore difficult to imagine an identity more provincially Western and less decolonial than contemporary non-binary identities. That's actually a real stinger. That's a really harsh critique and a hard one for a young person to come back from. What it's actually saying is, you people who call yourself non-binary, you think you're opposing something, but you are its confirmation. You think you're opposing the binary logic of the West, you are its confirmation. More than that, you think that you're able to just come into the world and exercise your ontological sovereign individuality. That's a Butlerian idea, right? We've all read our Butler. The Butlerian critique was that we thought we performed our gender, but actually our gender performs us. We don't choose it, it chooses us. We don't write the script is given, right? That's what he means by ontological sovereign individual versus unchosen genealogical bonds. This is a nonsense critique, and I'll tell you why. Because everyone who has not read Butler, and okay, that's not so many people, but anyone who hasn't been through a gender class in a post-structural context believes that they are an ontological sovereign being. So to somehow pin this on non-binary people, to me, makes no sense. Let me give you another reading of non-binary. For me, non-binary is a generational claim. It's the vast number of people who identify as non-binary are younger, and I believe that the emphasis in non-binary doesn't fall on binary, it falls on non. So they're actually saying no to binaries of many, many different kinds. And we could hear non-binary instead as a kind of giant fuck you from one generation to another that is trying to say no to environmental ruination, no to debt, right? We're handing on massive amounts of debt to young people in these Western cities. We're handing on debt. They have to pay for college. Many older people did not pay for college. They have to pay huge amounts of money to buy a house. Many older people did not pay massive amounts of money to buy a house. So this non is the destitution of the system as a whole that has been delivered to young people, to which they say no. No, thank you. No to all of it. And I think that that would be a more interesting reading of why so many people are attaching themselves to this term. A better reading then, if you want the theoretical reading of non-binary in that orbit, would be by Levi Horde, who says, non-binary demonstrates a resignification away from pre-existing binary determination without repeating its restrictions, doing damage to the assumption that one must be a certain type of subject to refuse a restricting ideology, to hold a resistant politics, or to participate in a coalition. And this is a refusal of that Kaji Amin reading. So hold on to that, okay? We can argue about that later if you want. Maybe there are different readings of non-binary in the room. But I definitely think around, for example, Israel, Gaza, certainly in the US, young people are adamant on college campuses that this genocide in Gaza is a defining struggle of their times. And they are mostly being told to be quiet by older people. And I think if you look in every area where we're talking about crisis, you will see a generational struggle happening. One term for that generational struggle is non-binary. All right, if we're destituting things, why not? Let's destitute feminism, given that feminism is a massive support system for right-wing authoritarianism worldwide. Feminist ideas are being used to support the refusal of recognition to trans people, and feminists themselves are carrying out an assault on trans women in particular. So I guess we tend to think of this turf feminism as reaching back to the 1970s and 80s, when an earlier generation of women also had concerns about trans women in particular. But when we reach back for that feminism, we miss another one that was contemporaneous with Anarchitecture and had sympathy with some of the ideologies that are arrayed under the heading of Anarchitecture. So first thing I would say about TERFs is they're not really feminists. They're actually fascist women who want to go back into the family, who want to go back to male and female, who believe in men and women only. I don't really know why we're calling them feminists. It's confusing, in fact, because then we have to destitute feminism. They are being called by some theorists now post-fascist feminists, but at any rate, they are better allied with Christian conservatives than with feminism per se. So what I want to do, though, as I just did with Anarchitecture, is go back to another strand of feminism that we can pull forward that was interested in tearing everything apart in the 1970s. So here's a very typical badge from that moment, from the 1970s. Lots of people wore these T-shirts. You know, if I had a hammer, I'd smash patriarchy. Oh, good, I found one. And that language of smashing patriarchy was not casual, right? There was actually a kind of violent orientation to radical feminism, and a lot of that particular feminism was not particularly transphobic either. So when we look back, we tend to cherry pick the feminism that we connect to turfdom, when we could go back and register a very different kind of feminism that was deeply interested in destituting the society that was built around the logics of patriarchy. Here's another destituting anarchitectural feminist, Valerie Solanas, who created in 1969 the Scum Manifesto, which used the language of anarchitecture even before there was anarchitecture, which was cutting things up. It was a society for the cutting up of men. And it was a hilarious manifesto that no one thought was funny, and that sort of fell out of favor until Andrea Long Chu, a now very famous trans woman, picked it up and said, actually, I think what Valerie Solanas was saying was, everyone should be a trans woman. And that's a great reading of the text. I'll take it. But at the same time, Solanas was pretty serious about cutting up men. So serious was she about using violence to challenge patriarchy that she is the person who went and shot Andy Warhol in the late 1960s and was arrested for doing so. And I've actually been reading a lot about Andy Warhol recently, and I think he bears a huge amount of responsibility for joining commerce to the art market. And I kind of feel like we should revisit Andy Warhol. She's the goat of history and he's the hero. Maybe we got those things the wrong way around. Just wondering. Okay, so there are a couple of films that I write about in this book, Anarchitecture After Everything, that were 100% committed to not just dismantling patriarchy, but taking apart the entire social structure that depended upon patriarchy on the one hand, white supremacy on the other, and was based upon gender normativity. And those films have been written out of the cinematic canon. This film, Born in Flames, has come back around to a certain extent, but how many people here have seen Born in Flames? A few people. Okay. It should be like up there with The Godfather, really. It's an amazing film. It was made by a collective for less than $100,000. And the conceit was that the socialist revolution has already happened and women and people of color are still in the margins. And so under those conditions, a group of women a group of Black women form a women's army. A group of white women say, no, we don't think we should pick up arms. And the Black women say, nothing is going to change unless we come and show that we mean business. And so they send a delegation, the Women's Army, to the Sahara to do an arms deal and bring those weapons back to the US, where they plan an armed uprising. I can kind of see why this film didn't stick around, right? This is like some pretty heady, dangerous stuff. But it was an incredibly advanced film, and it was, more importantly, an anarchist film committed to taking down the property regime. And that was literally the poster for the film. I mean, if you had a film now where the closest we could get to it is Virginie Despentes' Baise-moi, which is two lesbians on a serial killer bender. But this is a very outrageous representation of feminism, given the stories about feminism that we tell each other. One of the big ideas in Born in Flames is that women need to take over the airwaves. And so there are two women who are DJs in the film who run radical pirate radio stations. And there are multiple maneuvers in the film where people take over TV stations and radio stations and broadcast different information through those channels. And the final shot in the film is some women going up to the top of the World Trade Center and blowing up the radio tower on the top. And of course, this means something very different post 9/11, but it was a fantastic scene, and there's a glorious little detail about that shot, which was that the whole blowing up of the communications tower was made in post-production, and what they did was they used glitter to make it look like the tower was exploding. So at least one critic, Lucas Hildebrand, has written about glitter bombing as originating in Born of Flames. And so it's a reminder that this is a film, it's a representation, but it at least raises the question of violence and whether violence is a necessary part of a feminist movement that doesn't just want to oppose men. This is why the film is split between the white women and the black women, because the black women keep saying, but we're not against black men, we're against white patriarchy. And they form a very different kind of coalition. Jana Brown is one of the critics who has really brought this film back into circulation, and she comments on the kind of anarchist flavor of this film. She said it's an important text to revisit today as it invites us to rejuvenate a version of noncompliance that dances and screams and blows things up, that refuses and disrupts rather than appeals. What makes the film anarchist is that it refuses to offer any formula or solution. It provokes, stirs things up, and unsettles us. So by now, you can see that that's part of this anarchitectural logic, where we want to blow things up. We are not offering an alternative. We refuse to say what will happen next, but we are committed 100% to dancing, screaming, and exploding, okay? All right, one more film, and then I'll start moving towards trying to pull these threads together. And this is just for Simon. This is the film we talked about, a Dutch film from the late 70s, the early 80s, that almost no one has seen, even Dutch people who are very knowledgeable. Anyone here seen A Question of Science? Thank you, amazing. So this was a great film that was made by a very respected female director at the time, Marleen Goris. And I think in Dutch it was called The Silence of Christine M. So let me explain the film, and you'll see why nobody shows this film anymore. But maybe you'll begin to think that they should, okay? So it's called A Question of Silence. 3 women in a small Dutch town are established in the first 5 minutes of the film as being subject to continuous kind of microaggressions from a husband, from a co-worker, from a boss. Not spectacular abuse, not violence, not rape, microaggressions like, oh, well, you wouldn't understand that, those kinds of gestures. But we're led to believe that this is a continuous part of the fabric of life in this place, okay? So the 3 women don't know each other, go out into the city, and they randomly end up in a dress shop at the same time. One of the women takes a dress off the rack and puts it in her bag, getting ready to shoplift. And she goes towards the door, and the shopkeeper stops her. And he says, remove that dress, I'm going to call the police. And he threatens to call the police. And when he does that, the other 2 women come up. And the 3 women surround the shopkeeper, and one hits him. And then the other breaks a pane of glass and slashes at him. And we have a very long scene of these 3 women brutally murdering the shopkeeper. So that's all done in 10 minutes. And you're like, whoa, okay. And the rest of the film is about the trial and the psychological evaluation of the women. And the psychiatrist who's been assigned to figure out what's wrong with these women, are they insane, comes to the conclusion that they are not insane, but that the culture that they inhabit is insane. And she refuses to give the diagnosis that the court wants, at which point they all start laughing. The silence is because one of the women refuses to speak. And in the end, this becomes the strategy of all the women. It's very much a kind of Spivakian, can the subaltern speak? They refuse to speak because to do so would be to speak in the logic of the law. in which they are criminals or insane, and in which there is absolutely nothing that can justify this random act of violence. And therefore, they choose silence. And there's no conclusion really to the film. There's no resolution. We never hear from them about how this spontaneous action happened. And in fact, you're left, as Jana Brown said about Born in Flames, with a deeply discomforting sense that this could happen again, randomly, and that the conditions are there for spontaneous violence by women against men. This film was panned. I saw it when it came out, and I was like, holy shit, this is some interesting stuff. Never saw that film again. I've never seen it shown again. And it was talked about at the time as a kind of sad, infantile attempt to reverse the gender dynamics. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is, and as I said, I have a chapter on this in the book, is that there's a whole school of feminist film in the 1970s that is interested not simply in confronting sexism, for God's sake, or reforming the society, but literally using violence to take that social structure apart. And none of these movements are working together, but from very different places in the society, they are often saying the same thing in the language of anarchy and anarchitecture. All right, so let's try to, there was another one, Times Square, look it up, amazing. Another anarchitectural feminist film, and I have many of them. So there are feminist movements, and let's see what time it is. Wrapping up, would you say? Okay, all right. So I don't want us to think that, oh, we're stuck with these shitty turfs and there's no feminist movement up to the task of the contemporary crisis we live in, because in fact, Veronica Gago, who's an Argentinian feminist who wrote an amazing sociological study of trans feminist movements in Argentina, it's called the Feminist International. She gave a fantastic account of how feminist groups in Argentina, before the reemergence of a right-wing government in that country, were able to oppose an anti-abortion bill. And the way that they did so was by creating a feminist movement that brought as many people into association as possible. It centered upon trans women. It was a trans feminist movement in terms of its organizing base, and it appealed to everyone who was outside of the main economy. So one of the things that this group, Ni Una Menos, did was they called for a general strike, but not a general strike in the sort of Rosa Luxemburg idea that everyone who's working should put down their work and walk out on the job. A general strike in terms of the informal sectors of the economy, where everyone who is essential to the economy, but barely recognized by it, not protected within it, should stop working. And when, as Gago narrates, when trans women, sex workers, homeless people, taxi drivers, bus drivers, immigrants without papers, women working in the home for no pay, kids working before they are supposed to even be of age to work. When all of those people get together, you have a very, very powerful unit. And you can call it feminism or you could call it something else. But it's those kinds of solidarities that we're looking for through these alternative languages of political struggle, if you see what I mean. And some of them can be glimpsed through these aesthetic projects that I'm trying to lay out, and others are happening on the ground in places where feminism has been completely reimagined and has been reimagined in relationship to this kind of destituting logic. Okay. This is a quote from Gago, so you can see there's a kind of joyfulness in this protest movement. and she makes a big deal of how any movement that's going to oppose right-wing governments today has to be a mass movement. It cannot be a movement made up of a few sections of the society. The mass resonance of the call to the streets, given what we knew was simultaneously happening in other countries, made it an unforgettable day of collective effervescence. We shared scenes of everyday contempt, gossip about revolt, anonymous whispers on a day that, as we sang in the rain, we stopped the world and we found ourselves. And the key term there is stopping the world. It's not we want the world or even we are the world. The main language is stopping worlds. So I won't go into her, but just to use that phrase to get then to my concluding thought, which is that, you know, we live epistemologically in philosophy in something that we keep calling world. And that totality governs the reach of our imaginations. It determines the scope of our epistemologies. And it is an inheritance, after all, of a colonial system, as Spivak reminds us, that thought in terms of world from a colonial perspective, therefore potentially unworld. So we should be thinking in different kinds of units against world and in solidarity across all kinds of difference. I'll just conclude with two artworks that I think, because it's hard to say, oh, well, what does that look like? I mean, I gave you the Gago example, but there are lots and lots of works out there, many of them made by trans theater groups that are multiracial, that are interested in these unworlding dynamics. And this particular performance is actually, I just saw on email coming to Europe. It's called Weathering. It's a dance performance, and it's being performed in Amsterdam and 2 other European cities. And let me tell you what happens in Weathering, because it is a kind of unworlding experience. So in Weathering, you have a group of about 15 people of different kinds of embodiments, some trans, some disabled, some older, some younger, many people of color, all arrayed on a platform that you realize after you're in the theater, you've been there a while, you realize it's a bed. You also realize after about 20 minutes that it's moving really slowly. And I'd already been there half an hour and I didn't actually realize this thing was moving. And I was like, what are we doing here? It's one of those theater things where you're like, can I leave? And then suddenly about 40 minutes in, you realize this thing is picking up speed. 50 minutes in, it's really moving. And the whole group is clinging to each other. People's clothes are coming off. People are dizzy. People are falling. People are holding on to each other to be propped up. And then it hits maximum velocity and the bodies fly off the mattress. And then the whole thing sort of comes to an end. And I found this to be so moving. Obviously, the mattress is a globe. Obviously, we're watching a community of people who can only stay on the speeded up spinning globe if they hold on to each other. It's a performance that is done by the whole group. There's no solo, there's no individual. It's not possible to think of this performance outside of the group. And the thing that's being performed is the crisis that we are in, that gathers speed, gathers momentum, and the only way out is to stop it, to stop the world. So let me end then, and I know I'm jumping around, but let me end by suggesting that if we apply these concepts of unworlding and anarchitecture to trans embodiment, to new forms of feminism and solidarity, a few possibilities should come to us. First, bodies that are deemed to be out of place, like the trans body, should not seek to become legible in the system that has named them as the problem, right? That would be one outcome if we want an outcome. In other words, if trans bodies violate binary gender, then they cannot seek to be real or recognized or have rights through the same binary that says they are in violation of it. Second, transness transness should not seek to become a new vehicle for capital, right? And that was always the neoliberal promise. Come on in, the water's lovely, you too can be part of this economy. Transness should not seek to become a new vehicle for capital and must become uninteresting to capital. And then finally, trans bodies that want to represent this unworlding, this unbuilding and dismantling orientation have to find other representational systems to do so. And we have to do so because if we don't, we're going to stay exactly in this crisis that we find ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack, a lot. It was very inspiring and a revolutionary speech. I like it a lot. I think that we're gonna have a lot of questions to you. It was very interesting. What I find very interesting in the realm of this conference is that we are searching for new ways of representing different ideas, especially when we are thinking about transness. And I think that you are giving these new ideas how to represent it also through art. Because I have a feeling that for many years we had this situation that transness or queerness was represented by figurative and bodies and trying to gain visibility. And what you are presenting is you're more focusing on non-figurative, abstractive ways of showing transness. And could you please tell us more about it?
That's exactly right. And it's not just figure versus abstraction. And I know that, suggesting, oh, we'll look at these artworks and that will explain everything. That's not helpful in some ways either. But what art can do is be speculative in ways that can allow us to glimpse some of these exit routes out of the logics that we are captured by. And it's really true. I wrote about this a long time ago when I was writing about drag. I was like, wow, it's so hard to represent a trans body, because if you represent the trans body passing, then people are like, oh, that's a cute guy or that's a beautiful woman. But if you represent the trans body as not passing, then you're also confirming that the trans body somehow can't do gender in this, mandated way. So it was it presented itself back in the day as a problem. And what I've noticed is that so many artists now, first of all, don't foreground transness necessarily in their art. And when I was contacting various people that I was writing about and saying, I need an image of your work for my book, they'd be like, that's fine, but don't call me a trans artist. And that was really hard because I'm making a claim about trans art in the book. One artist said to me, you can say that I'm an artist who doesn't like to be called a trans artist. I was like, great, I'll use that configuration because it conveys something about his relationship to trans. But none of these folks are using anything that resembles a body, because the logic of the body is precisely the logic that, makes, forces you to say things in ways that simply place you back into the system that you're here to contest.
I'm also thinking that maybe you can also tell more about your understanding of transness, because as far as I understand, it's not so much connected with identity or with some fixed essentialist thinking, but it's more like mode of doing or undoing, this melting.
I think that's a great question. I think what I'm calling trans is the assault on the binary gender system that is multiplied across other binary systems. That's why I'm focused on non-binary as well. I think I'm not I'm not saying this group of people, but I'm not saying that group of people either, in the sense that that destituting logic comes from people who are making these cuts on their own body. So in relationship to Matta-Clark, that idea that you can change something through the introduction of vacancy or the removal of something, I mean, that is a description of what many people call trans surgeries. We want there to be an additive logic. Oh, what did you have done? But for many of us, it's what we took off, we removed. Where there were breasts, there is now nothing. And that nothing is your transness. And that's a hard thing to grasp, but that's the anarchitectural logic. The thing that is not there anymore is your transness.
I also wanted to ask about how you understand anarchy, because I think it's like very important in the Anarchitecture project.
Right. Wow. The big questions. Okay. Well, I mean, for Matta-Clark, anarchy was anarchy. Like he was making an assault on property and on the way that the city was using property to dispossess poor people and to give money to the wealthy and to the managers of property. Trump made his money in 1974 when he bought a hotel that nobody else wanted to buy in New York City. And his lawyer at the time was the infamous Roy Cohn. People may know who Roy Cohn was, right? He was the gay lawyer to Nixon, who was also the prosecutor in the McCarthy hearings. He ensured that Ethel Rosenberg was put to death on accusations of treason and so on. Roy Cohn was Trump's lawyer in 1974 when he bought this dilapidated hotel. And the city, in order for that transaction to go through, the city that was bankrupt at that moment needed $14 million from Trump in tax money. And Cohen bribed city officials so that Trump didn't have to pay that $14 million. And that was his first transaction in which he did not pay taxes, that then led to a massive profit from a very bad purchase. Do you see what I mean? So this is the meaning of anarchy, is that anarchy was always a critique of the regime of property. But in the 19th century, people who were theorizing anarchy couldn't see or predict what would happen to the regime of property. There could have been no understanding of speculative capital at that time, as in you buy a house not simply because you want to live in it, but you buy it because you realize its increase in value will be good for you over time. That's why people buy houses. Very few people buy the house to live in the house, and the people who would cannot afford them, right? So anarchy now means a critique, an assault, a violent assault on the regime of property that has delivered everything to a few people and nothing to everybody else. That is the regime of property that we live with. We would be crazy not to be anarchists at this point.
And also at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that transness, that trans politics should be anti-capitalistic. And can you also, because I think it's connected.
Not exactly anti-capitalist. I mean, we should all be anti-capitalist, but we're all actually embedded in capitalism. There's not an outside to it from which we can say, oh, of course we're anti-capitalist. I'm saying we should not be seeking to be attractive to capital. That's a little bit different. And that's a less urgent problem right now, but certainly I just don't think we're in a moment any longer that's neoliberal. You know, we're past neoliberalism. No economic regime is like trying to collect trans people to be sponsors for their brands anymore. Do you know what I mean? Whereas that did characterize, the last decade. But that is part of what capital does. It takes the thing that could be oppositional and turns it into a new channel for profit and commodification. And so I'm trying to say, how can we inhabit transness in a way that is not attractive to capital, which is a different claim.
I think that the notions that you're proposing, like unworlding, undoing, stopping the word restitution, are very interesting, and they're going to stay with us for a longer time. But I'm also, maybe it's another like difficult question because it's like how to move from the discourse to the practice, especially now under Trump administration. You're the professor of Gender and Literature Studies department. And I know that you are suffering like generally on like all the trans people and queer people in US now are going through very difficult times, but also, as you mentioned, and as we are looking a bit from distance and we are very worried about, it's also a difficult situation for queer and gender studies. And can these ideas that you're proposing be somehow moved into practice in some kind of resistance, or you're more willing to refuse the system and not collaborate at all, even if...
Yeah, I'm definitely willing to do that. But let's be clear about what's happening. Like the war that Trump et al. Are waging on trans people is against young trans people, because what they think is happening is that gender studies programs and the public visibility of trans people is converting their kids. That's what they think. And that's why they're trying to cut off the supply of transgender care to young people and drag shows in universities. They think this is a contaminating logic that has to be stopped. The real target of these authoritarian governments, are immigrants. I mean, that's who's being detained. But the logic is of returning to a binary gender system with men, women, and children who are not going to become trans. It's a kind of logic about, let's make sure our kids don't become trans. So, I feel like I want to be specific because it's not like hordes of ICE officers are descending on trans people or something like this. Is there a practical outcome for this kind of argument? Look, we've been governed by concepts of development and progress and becoming and doing. There's no practical, program for those concepts, but they do govern us, and we do think in those terms. Similarly, this is a language that looks to shift and transform the way we even talk about change. And it does matter whether you say that you want to build a new world or you say you want to unbuild this one. Those are completely different things. And I've had people say to me, well, it's easy to tear something down. It's a lot harder to build something. Oh, really? How are we doing tearing anything down? I don't see us doing really well at taking apart global authoritarian shifts. We see them. We know why they're there. We understand that we're ruled by very, very wealthy men who own everything. If we think it's easy to take things apart, we should be doing that. I think it's very, very, very difficult to make that kind of change. And if we're just simply going on our merry way with this idea of hope and, in the future things will be better, we're going to be very, very disappointed. In fact, there's a great anarchist novel that I recommend to people. It's called Everything for Everyone. And it's by M.E. O'Brien, who's an abolitionist, and Abdul Haji is the name of the co-author. And they co-authored a novel that is set in 20 years in the future. And a series of communes have already happened in the wake of Gaza. And the Gaza commune and the commune in New York led the way to a kind of anarchist world revolution. And the book is a series of oral interviews with people who have survived. It's a fantastic book, and it is very practical. There's an ecological project, there's an abolitionist project, there's a sex worker project. People are bemused at thinking about, oh, wow, people use money. Why would they have done that? There's a post-money society. It's a super practical handbook. Read it. Yeah.
Thank you for the recommendation. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you for excellent lecture. There is another concept in Matta-Clark, which is discrete violations. And when it comes to violence and violation, he uses that concept to describe his interventions into buildings. And I wonder if this discreteness introduces something different into the logic of explanation of a difference between building and collapsing or tearing down the things.
That's so interesting. Can you, before you pass the mic on, can you say something about how you understand the discrete part of that in relation to the fake estates, or what was it?
He started to use it in relation to the first cuttings that he did in the cardboard as sketches for what he will do later on in the buildings. But interesting thing there is that he introduces these spaces in between, which are the spaces which, as every in between, is related then to the logic of interest or interest, you know, and his interest in the space in between, something that is a whole, or as you said, something that is not there anymore, is very interesting to think about as a space from which we can observe the being within the composition and not in complete decomposition of the thing.
That's just really beautifully said. I so appreciate that. But it did really make me think about the fake estates, which were these little bits of land that Matta-Clark bought for $25 a piece, little parcels of land that were too small to build anything on or to live on. And that was his condition for buying them, was that you would not be able to actually occupy them. But it represents symbolically this discrete violation. Like, is it practical? Is it going to result in a massive gesture of dispossession? No, but it chips away at the regime of property. That's exactly what it does. And in the process, it allows for all of these little bits of land to become devalued. Because if there's a parcel of land that you buy and you don't do anything with it, it reduces, its value reduces down to nothing. The only thing that you have to do is pay taxes on it. That's why we know about that, was because his widow ended up having to pay taxes on these little pieces of land, and she then realized it was a whole other project. But I love this idea of the small gesture, because Matta-Clark was deeply uninterested in any kind of monumentalism. And in my book, just, you know, to say more about that, I oppose him to Philip Johnson, who most people oppose him to Le Corbusier, but it was Philip Johnson who was sculpting the shape of New York at that time. And Johnson was the one who made these big monumental phallic glass towers, and it's Matta-Clark who wants to smash the windows. So discrete violation, beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have a small problem. One thing, like Matta-Clark also did the famous project which was called Food, the restaurant. But I mean, it ended up, you know, very quickly. So that's my slight problem. And also, to me, the problem is that even he didn't monetize very much what he was doing. From the project documentation, this was also the monetization of the whole activist process. And now these original photographs, they cost fortune. So I think this is a slight paradox, which is like the relation between institutional critique and the institutions which are critiqued, which were extremely flexible in monetizing the things which they were critiquing them. So isn't this a little trap?
I mean, I don't know whether those photographs are. I mean, first of all, the photograph is not the work. The work was the cut, like with splitting. You know, it's the void made into the house, and the house is then gone. And Matta-Clark did take money for certain commissions. I mean, he's not. He wasn't a trust fund person or something. He had a famous father, but Matta didn't give him money. So he did take money for commissions, but he in no way made massive amounts of money from these practices. And in fact, when Donald Wall interviewed him in 74 and said, but don't you want to leave something that can be put, say, in the Hirshhorn? He said, no. If I was to do something for the Hirshhorn, they must invite me to come and I will make a cut into the Hirshhorn itself. And I love that, that response. If after his death, the photographs of this work becomes expensive, I mean, that's a very, very different commodity chain than his cuts. For me, that's not necessarily a contradiction. However, I will say this is the problem with working with the archive of a charismatic artist is, you know, we get caught up in Matta-Clark. And so in the book, I actually make the point that the final cut has to be Matta-Clark. We actually have to cut Anarchitecture loose from Matta-Clark, which is kind of what I'm trying to do here, in order to give it a life after the charismatic biography of the artist. And after all, it was a collective. As you say, the food project was made by the whole collective. Yeah. And even as I tell the story, it's all Matta-Clark all the time. And it's very hard to stop telling the story of Matta-Clark, but I really do try in the book. And I try to extract from this incredibly interesting anarchive of gestures and vacancies something that we can use now to, you know, push back on the art market, the real estate market, and most of all, architecture.
No, I mean, I have no problem with contradictions. I only, I have this, you know, suspicion about the trap that with the critique of institutions, which is accepted, we legitimize those institutions. That's my problem.
Okay.
Question. It's a question.
Well, if all we're doing is institutional critique and we just re-legitimize the institution, then there's no point. But the point of destitution is to get free of the institutions in order that some other set of relations can emerge that hasn't already been configured by the institution. So I mean, I think we're talking along the same lines there. Yeah. You can pass the mic back.
Yes, first of all, thank you very, very much for an excellent lecture. I would have actually been very happy to have another half hour where to continue the conversation around unworlding, because I've seen you talk about building a little bit more in depth previously, and there is a slightly complex situation, is that for whom? And that is, as working within the arts, I think it's of importance of what you have talked about today is that there's no for whom. The destitution and architecture needs to be whatever, and somebody will pick it up in some way which cannot be produced or estimated or hoped for. No, but I have perhaps a slightly odd question, and concerning hospitality that was on in the previous panel. Derrida talks about mourning in his book about the work of mourning. He there addresses how do we don't get over forms of loss, but remain with loss, sort of how to remain with an emptiness without filling it with Prozac or renovating an old car or some ridiculous stuff. And I'm curious about how would you consider relationship between Matta-Clark's work and a Derridian form of mourning, in the sense that it is also important that there was no, for me it's curious, of utmost importance, that Matta-Clark's work does not have a destination. It doesn't wish for anything. It asks us to fantasize, but not to wish for something. Maybe this was more of a comment, but I would be interested if you could elaborate something around for whom staying with loss and the non-directionality of the aesthetic, particularly the aesthetic encounter.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really sensitive question, because in fact, when I was writing the intro for the book, I kept falling into that mistake. You know, I have had to rewrite this intro like 10 times, because it's so hard not to give it a destination. And it's so hard not to fill the emptiness with symbolic meaning. And you can see I am doing that. And I try to stay with the vacancy, but it goes against our project of meaning making. And yet I think it's not a deconstructive project either. So I just want to say that. The unworlding piece, for whom, I mean, it has to be, as the title of the book I just mentioned suggests, has to be for everyone. It can't be just for these people. It has to be for everyone, unworlding for everyone. Worlding was a project for some people, and those people are still doing well from the business of worlding, you know. But unworlding, I route it through Afro-pessimism, where you have the most devastating critique of world. The books that I use are Denise de Silva's Unpayable Debt and Calvin Warren's Negative Ontology. And for me, there's a much more interesting philosophical reading there of the unworld that is implied by the white supremacist world, which is a world made for people. So we would have to make an unworld that was not for anyone and was for everyone. About 20 years after Matta-Clark's death, there was this deconstructive architecture show at MoMA created by Philip Johnson. And to me, that was the end of the possibility of anarchitecture. It gets taken up as this kind of new theoretical language, and it becomes a launching pad for starchitecture. And so there's a way in which I've consciously sort of stayed away from deconstruction. But in your question, I can hear the reason to go there, for this mourning that cannot be resolved. You know, Derrida says, if forgiveness is to be real, then it sort of can't be given. You can only, an unforgivable act has to remain unforgiven. And I think all of those resonances are in anarchitecture. I think the question is, if we take this language and we want to stay with it, can we? Or, you know, at what point does meaning and something and presence slip back in? And what would it take to actually stay with the void? So I'm going to think about the hospitality as one way into that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was really great, and I have so many notes. I have two questions. The one would be just about like your practice and how you encounter the art that you encounter. The reason that this question comes up for me is because the sort of Bowel, Eve, I have his name, but Eve Laris, is then shown in MoMA, right? And you know, a lot of people are boycotting MoMA. I mean, there's, you know, you're currently in Berlin. We're boycotting a lot of art institutions in Berlin. And you know, when I'm thinking about anarchist philosophies, where I encounter those most is in anarchist spaces. And there's a kind of extraction that does enter into art institutions. And this is not a question about like, oh, how dare we be in MoMA? It's more, I'm wondering how you, as you scavenger, to use your own term, through these kind of spaces, where do you encounter it? And how do you, like, also on a very embodied level and an affective level, how do you, if at all, differentiate between what you absorb in institutional spaces and in like counter-institutional or movement spaces?
Yeah, and that actually follows on from the institutional critique question, so I appreciate that, Simon. Yeah, many of the things that I wrote about in this book ended up somehow in MoMA. And the thing is, it's hard to judge artists for doing things that, you know, give them opportunities professionally, because we're living in a world where many of the artists I write about simply don't make a living from art. They make a living from teaching. Eve doesn't make a living from art, as far as I can tell. I write about Jesse Darling. I met with him in Oxford 2 weeks ago. He doesn't make his money from art. He makes it from teaching. I do write about Nicole Eisenman, and they do make money from art, but they paid a steep price for supporting Palestine. Many people said that they didn't want to buy Eisenman's work anymore. I don't think we should have standards for artists, you know, when I teach at Columbia. I'm not the person who's going to be preaching to an artist that they should not be doing something at MoMA. Now, that said, Simon, in the book, I have a massive critique of MoMA, because my critique of Johnson is a critique of MoMA. And it's not a critique of who shows there or the fact that Adam Pendleton's show is there. It's not about the artists. It's about the history of the museum itself and the history of how that permanent collection came to be. I mean, Philip Johnson, who was the founder of the architecture department, was in the 1930s an out and out Nazi. He was a gay man. He was a Nazi. He was the architecture director at MoMA, and his name is still on the wall of that frigging museum, that museum that is saying that it is against anti-Semitism, but it has one of the most infamous anti-Semites of the 20th century on its wall. So the critique of the institution, for me, doesn't run through the artist. And I think there's a whole range of artists in the book. And I came to these artists through their use of an anarchitectural language. It was very specific to that. Jesse Darling had been talking about collapse for the last 10 years. Eve Laris Cohen's work, going back to the Whitney Biennial, was about unmaking the floor, which resonated so much with that piece I showed you by Matta-Clark. And then just as recently as last year, Nicole Eisenman put a crane on its side in Madison Square Park in order to point to another crane that was on top of a massive luxury apartment building that was going up and being built by Goldman Sachs. So these are very specific trans artists who have literally made a critique of capital and property through anarchitecture while commenting on the trans body. So this was a less random archive than maybe some of the ones I've used in the past. But like you, I do want to think about this larger question of the institutional critique.
It's here. All right, thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. And I wonder, where would you place someone like Lebbeus Woods in, speculative architectural thinking? And I thought of him a lot actually at the beginning of your talk, obviously, right? So when an architecture arrives at the point of lack, decomposition, and then demolition, and his work kind of begins from there, right? So the drawing of the building already appears as a ruin. And that, of course, the recognition, again, of the military regime, war, and a particular point, which he's always very ambiguous in terms of whether that is a destination or that is some point, a beginning of something else, right? So in the project itself is called radical reconstruction. So reconstruction.
Who's the architect or the artist?
Lebbeus Woods. He taught at Cooper Union in New York. Okay. Yeah, and he did a lot of work kind of inspired or in relation to Sarajevo War and etc., etc. Right. So, and that is basically the drawings that already buildings in decomposition. What all these years within Ukraine, for instance, it constantly, like his work comes back to me because obviously there is so much talk about reconstruction, right? So they talk about reconstruction in Ukraine, and the first conference was in May 2022. And I was like perplexed and kind of amazed by this desire, right? So, and when I was looking at the ruins, especially with this January in Kharkiv, which is like the capital of modern architecture, if you wish, in Eastern Europe. So, and all these buildings in ruins, sometimes it feels like that's where they have to preserve somehow like that. Because, and what Wood's work was sort of kind of like speculative inspiration to this, because this is a presence of ruination, of disordering, of, and again, it's not necessarily anarchy, but it's rather recognition of other force that is so much embedded in our so-called peace. And again, yeah, also in a certain way against certain binary logic, right? So of war peace is something opposite. And excuse me for stretching this term so far. Yeah, anyway, I mean, if you're not familiar with his work, but there are others, obviously, who did very similar gesture in terms of, you know, to begin with a ruin or something like this, that, again, an acknowledgement of destruction as being a process present, etc. Thank you.
I'm sort of inclined to just let that comment stand because it was beautiful, and I just really appreciate the way you took up the language to think with these war-ravaged terrains. You know, a place where you really do have ruination, but there isn't a sense that, you know, repair would make things better. And the ruin is also not the beautiful ruin of the monastery falling into disrepair. I think in the very specific context that I'm talking about, it's less about the ruin and more about abandonment. I mean, that was what pockmarked New York City in the 1970s, where all of these buildings that had been abandoned as opposed to buildings that had been bombed. And these seem different to me. Somebody has asked me in one of these presentations, somebody asked me, but isn't, like, you know, unbuilding things, unmaking things, ruining things, isn't that the goal in Gaza, to just like take it all down? And I'm like, that's not the goal. The goal is the building. And we saw that with that hideous Trump video saying Trump Gaza, you know, which he reveals what their real interest in Gaza is real estate. It's the building you should be worried about, not the destruction is war. But it's, if repair were to come, we'd have Trump Gaza, and that's the piece that's obscene. Keep speaking.
Hello, thanks for the wonderful keynote. There's a lot to agree with what you brought up. especially a couple of things, is like the institutional critique cannot go through the artist. That should be like written like in gold letters with like glitter bombs coming out of it. But I want to take issues with two things. One is, and I'm sure your understanding of it is nuanced, which is sort of like the place of violence in political struggle, especially after what took place in Washington yesterday, where a legitimate slogan like Free Palestine turned into a form of political violence that I think I cannot endorse as someone who identifies with the Palestinian cause to a certain degree. That's one thing. And like, I'm sure you have something to say about that. And the second thing is more mathematical and about unworlding, which is any kind of unworlding is another kind of worlding. It's kind of like saying like -3 or 3. -3 has a categorical relation with 3. If I borrow $3,000 from the bank, it's -3,000, but in my pocket, it's still $3,000 in my pocket. So for me, your project of unworlding is a new form of world making or worlding, except it acknowledges something. It acknowledges something. So and also, I'm sure you agree that like you're not interested in creating a binary between worlding and unworlding, because that's sort of like reinforces a kind of binary. That's it. Thank you again for this wonderful talk and like your courage to speak about Palestine on the stage. So yeah, so thank you so much for this wonderful keynote.
Okay, thank you for your comment. That's actually really helpful. And you're probably right. It probably isn't a binary with worlding, but attached to unworlding are a whole bunch of other philosophies that are not the same as the philosophies that have been attached to this thing we call world. You know, world is a big part of German idealism. World is a big part of colonial understandings of trade routes. Whereas unworlding is a category that really appears mostly within Black thought. And, you know, I mean, I've been using it for a while now to mean this kind of emptying out of a particular episteme in order to see what else is possible to say. So that's one thing. I don't think that -3 is the same as 3. So you can borrow $3,000 from the bank, and you can have the $3,000 in your pocket. That's what young people are being told, by the way. But you will have $3,000 in your pocket, but you'll have like 25% less than that because you will owe the bank interest. So it is in no way mathematically the same thing. The minus is not the same as the plus, and we should not fall for that. Even though it was a nifty example. I don't know if I want to comment on, of course, it's just horrible that these Israeli aides were shot, just as it's horrendous that, you know, 1,200 people were taken hostage. None of that justifies what's happening in Gaza. None of it. And saying, oh, we shouldn't meet violence with violence. But isn't that what Israel is doing, is meeting violence with violence? So I don't think that we should be measuring in that way, like these lives were taken first. I mean, there's no first here. We would have to go back to 1948 to figure out what chain of events led to the 2 people being shot in Washington yesterday. I think I'm saying that where violence is only the right of the state, we're in trouble. And you know, we can look at many different examples in history, from the Black Panthers to the writings of Frantz Fanon, to see why we cannot simply abandon violence. I just don't think we can. And I think when we say we're abandoning violence, we're not. We're often still speaking in the language of violence, or we're threatening violence, or we're implying that violence could follow. So I'm interested, at any rate, in imaginative conjurings of the possibility of violence, because they refuse to leave feminism and other oppositional projects in the place of always being the peacemakers. And they suggest that, you know, complete repression of this kind may well eventually be answered with a violence that is unprecedented. I think you have to at least propose that.